June 14, 1944, Normandy. France 2, 8 kilometers inland from Omaha Beach, 05, for 7 hours. The transmission seized at the worst possible momentous scream of metal on metal that cut through the morning fog like a wounded animal, and Corporal James Jimmy Reardon knew, with the cold certainty of a man who'd already lost 3 crews, that they were about to die. "She's locked." Sergeant Miller's voice cracked over the intercom, panic bleeding through the static. "We're dead in the water." Through the narrow vision slit, Jimmy could see them 3 German Panzer IVs emerging from the tree line like iron predators, their long 75mm guns already traversing toward the crippled Sherman. The fog was lifting too fast, burning away under the weak June sun, exposing them in the middle of the field like a wounded deer before wolves. "Bail out! Bail out!" Miller was screaming now, but Jimmy's hands were already moving, not toward the escape hatch, but deeper into the engine compartment. His fingers found the access panel, tore it open. The transmission housing was hot enough to blister skin, but he didn't feel it. He was somewhere else back in his father's garage in Detroit, elbow deep in a 36 Ford. The old man's voice in his ear, "Sometimes, son, the craziest idea is the only one that works." The first German shell screamed overhead, close enough that Jimmy felt the displacement of air like a physical slap. It detonated 40 yards behind them, showering the Sherman with dirt and shrapnel. The second would find its mark. His fingers closed around the vertical volute spring, the component that no one ever touched, that every manual said was perfectly engineered, perfectly placed. Except it wasn't. He'd seen it now in 17 broken Shermans, seen the pattern that no one else had noticed, the spring mounted too close to the transmission, vibrating at just the wrong frequency, metal fatiguing metal, failure propagating like a disease through the entire drive system. "Reardon, we're leaving." Private Cooper's hands grabbed at his shoulders, trying to pull him out. 30 seconds, Jimmy shouted, wrenching at the mounting bolts with a wrench that wasn't designed for this angle. This position, the manual said it took 4 hours to properly remount a volute spring. The manual was written by engineers who'd never had panzers aiming at them. The second shell hit, not their tank god or fate or dumb luck, had sent it 3 feet too far left, slamming into the earth beside the right track. The Sherman rocked like a ship in a storm, and Jimmy's head cracked against the transmission housing hard enough to see stars, taste blood. But his hands kept working. "Jimmy, that was Miller," his voice carrying something beyond panic, now a kind of resigned grief, the sound of a man watching a friend die. The spring came free. For one crystalline moment, Jimmy held the entire problem in his hands, 6 pounds of tempered steel, machined 2 tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, mounted in exactly the wrong place by engineers who'd never had to watch men burn alive in tanks that stopped moving at the worst possible moment. He could see it clearly now, the whole catastrophic cascade, the spring positioned vertically when it should have been horizontal, absorbing vibrations parallel to the drive shaft instead of perpendicular to it, creating harmonic resonance that over days, weeks of operation fractured the transmission casing from the inside out, 200 Shermans, 200 crews, and nobody had seen it because nobody thought to look at a component that was working perfectly. His father had taught him that the difference between a good mechanic and a great one wasn't. Knowledge, it was the willingness to question what everyone else accepted as truth. Jimmy rotated the spring 90 degrees horizontal now, instead of vertical land, started remounting it. His hands were steady despite the blood running into his left eye, despite the sound of panzer engines getting closer, despite Miller's voice still calling his name like a prayer or a curse. The third shell hit the ground 15 feet in front of them, close enough that the explosion lifted the Sherman's front end, close enough that Jimmy felt the heat wash over him like opening an oven door. Smoke and fire billowed through the vision slits. "Starting her up." Miller's voice came from somewhere distant, somewhere beyond the ringing in Jimmy's ears. The engine coughed, caught, died. Jimmy's wrench slipped, skinning his knuckles raw against the transmission casing. He could hear Cooper praying in the driver's seat, a rushed stream of Hail Marys blending with Miller's cursing and the shriek of more incoming rounds, and the metallic clank-clank of panzer treads on hard ground. One bolt left, the wrench turned, the bolt seated. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Crazy ideas don't seem so crazy when they save your life. Try it now." The engine roared to life on this time when Miller threw her into gear. The transmission caught. The Sherman lurched forward like a wounded animal finding its feet. Gathering speed, tracks churning mud and torn grass, as they accelerated toward the cover of a destroyed farmhouse 200 yards distant. The fourth shell hit exactly where they'd been 3 seconds earlier, carving a crater deep enough to bury a man. Jimmy collapsed against the transmission housing, his entire body shaking, the wrench still clutched in his bleeding hands. Through the vision slit, he watched the Bocage country blur past the ancient hedgerows of Normandy, unchanged for 1,000 years, until men brought tanks and artillery to tear them apart. They made it to cover. Miller cut the engine, and for a long moment, the only sound was 5 men breathing hard in the cramped darkness of the Sherman's interior, alive when they should have been dead. "What the hell did you do?" Miller's voice was quiet now, strange. Jimmy looked down at his hands, at the blood and grease and burned skin. Changed where the spring sits. Horizontal instead of vertical. Stops the harmonic vibration from, "I don't care about the science." Miller's face appeared in the dim light. Younger than his 32 years despite the premature gray at his temples. "Can you do it to the others?" The others? Jimmy thought about the tank park 3 kilometers back, where 67 M4 Shermans sat waiting for repair. Their transmissions seized or failing, their crews bivouacked in foxholes and muddy tents, waiting for replacement parts that might take weeks to arrive from England. He thought about the 3rd platoon, who'd lost 4 tanks in 2 days, not to German guns, but to their own equipment failing at the worst possible moments. He thought about Private Torres, who Sherman had locked up during a German counterattack near Curtin, who'd burned to death because he couldn't get the driver's hatch open in time. "Yeah," Jimmy said softly. "Yeah, I can do it to the others." Miller nodded once, then keyed the radio. "Bulldog 6, this is Bulldog 3-2. We're mobile, and we've got something Command needs to hear about. How many broken Shermans you got in the tank park?" "All of them." "Good. Keep them there." "We're coming in." The radio crackled with questions, demands, the usual chaos of a hedgerow war where every field might hide an enemy and every decision might kill someone. But Jimmy barely heard it. He was already calculating how many springs he could remount in an hour, how many tanks he could bring back to life, while engineers in London argued about field modifications and proper procedures. 200 Shermans had failed with the original design. He was going to fix them with something no manual would ever recommend, a mechanic's crazy idea. Born in the moment between life and death, proven in the 6 seconds it took to drive clear of German guns, outside, the fog had finally burned away completely, revealing the Norman countryside in all its terrible beauty, the ancient stone walls, the apple orchards, the small fields that had known the tread of Roman legions and Viking raiders, and now American tanks. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like summer thunder. Cooper appeared at his shoulder, 19 years old and from Nebraska. Farm boy strong and scared in the way all smart men were scared in war. That really gonna work on the other tanks? Jimmy looked at the repositioned spring, at the simple 90-degree rotation that every engineer would say was wrong, that every manual would reject, that would save lives in ways that wouldn't appear in any after-action report or medal citation. "Yeah," he said, "it'll work." And then, quieter, almost to himself, "It has to." Because in the fields beyond their hiding place, in the tank parks and bivouacs scattered across 6 miles of contested French countryside, 200 crews were waiting. 200 groups of men who trusted that their equipment would work when the moment came, who didn't know that a flaw in the design was killing them as surely as German armor. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of fog. In the east, the sound of fighting grew closer, the distinctive crack of American 76mm guns, the deeper boom of German 88s, the endless rattle of machine guns turning the air to lead. Sergeant Miller started the engine again, the sound somehow different, now steadier, more confident. "All right, boys, let's go tell Command that a corporal from Detroit just solved a problem that's been killing us for 8 days. The Sherman rolled forward, tracks biting into French soil, carrying 5 men who'd lived when they should have died, and 1 mechanic with bleeding hands and a crazy idea that just might save an army. Behind them, in the crater where they'd almost died, smoke still rose into the pale morning sky, a marker, a memorial, a reminder of how close it had been. But Jimmy Reardon wasn't looking back. He was already thinking about the next tank and the one after that, and all the others waiting in the motor pool with their crews counting the hours until replacement parts arrived from a supply chain that moved at the speed of bureaucracy while men died at the speed of combat. 200 tanks. He had work to do. The war had 8 days left in Normandy before the great breakout toward Paris. But in those 8 days, a mechanic's crazy spring placement would spread from tank to tank, crew to crew, a field modification that saved more lives than any medal citation would ever record, not because it was in the manual, but because it worked. And sometimes, in war as in life, that's the only thing that matters. June 14, 1944, Tank Assembly Area, Baker, Normandy, France. 11:34 hours, the tank park looked like a graveyard for steel giants. 67 M4 Shermans sat in ragged rows across a muddy field that had been an apple orchard before the war came. Some were blackened by fire, others pockmarked with shrapnel. But most looked pristine from the outside. 33 tons of American engineering that simply refused to move. Their crews had erected pup tents in the shadows of their dead machines, and the whole scene had the atmosphere of men waiting for a funeral that kept getting postponed. Jimmy Reardon climbed down from Sergeant Miller's Sherman, his legs unsteady. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving behind the shakes and the bone-deep exhaustion that came after cheating death. His hands were wrapped in bandages that were already soaking through with blood and transmission fluid. "Wait here," Miller said, heading toward a cluster of officers gathered around a map table under a camouflage net. "Let me handle command first." But Jimmy wasn't looking at the officers. He was looking at the tanks, at the crews, sitting in the mud, cleaning weapons they hadn't fired, writing letters they might never send. He recognized faces from the 3rd Platoon, guys who'd lost friends when transmissions locked up at the wrong moment. Private Kowalski, whose loader had burned. Corporal Hayes, who'd watched his driver die trying to escape a seized tank under mortar fire. They recognized him too. Word traveled fast in a tank unit. "Heard you drove out hot," Kowalski called, standing up from where he'd been cleaning his Thompson. "Miller's tank was DOA this morning." "Fixed it," Jimmy said simply. "Fixed it how? We've been waiting 8 days for replacement transmissions from supply." Jimmy started walking toward Kowalski's tank, a Sherman, with Bad Penny stenciled on the turret in white paint. "Show me your problem." Captain said not to touch nothing until the mechanics from Show Me. Kowalski exchanged glances with Hayes, then shrugged. "She locked up 2 clicks from here. We were pulling back from a patrol, and the whole transmission just ... seized. Like someone threw a wrench into the gears. Had to get towed back by Jennings' tank." Jimmy didn't wait for permission. He climbed up onto Bad Penny's hull, dropped through the driver's hatch into the familiar cramped darkness. The smell hit him immediately: oil, sweat, cordite, and that metallic tench that all Shermans had, like the tank was slowly bleeding out from the inside. His hands found the transmission access panel, worked it open. The housing was still warm from yesterday's failure. He played his flashlight over the assembly, and there it was, the same pattern he'd seen in 17 other tanks. The vertical volute spring, positioned exactly where the engineers in Detroit had specified, vibrating at the exact wrong frequency to crack the transmission casing over time. "You're going to think this is crazy?" Jimmy called up through the hatch. "Everything about this war is crazy," Kowalski said. "What's one more thing?" 20 minutes later, Jimmy had Bad Penny's spring remounted horizontally. Kowalski started her up, and the engine caught with a roar that sounded like resurrection. The transmission engaged smoothly, no grinding, no protest, just the solid mechanical purr of a drive system that suddenly remembered how to work. Kowalski sat in the driver's seat, his hands on the controls, tears running down his face. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "Jesus Christ, she's alive!" By the time Jimmy climbed out, a crowd had gathered. 30, 40 men, maybe more tank crews, who'd been waiting in the mud for parts that might never come, who'd watched friends die because equipment failed at the worst possible moments. "What did you do?" Hayes asked. Jimmy held up the wrench, covered in blood and grease, rotated the spring mount 90 degrees, horizontal instead of vertical. "Stops the harmonic vibration from fracturing the can you do mine and mine." "How long does it take?" The voices overlapped, desperate and hopeful in equal measure. Jimmy looked at the field full of dead tanks, at the faces of men who'd been feeling useless while the war went on without them. "I can do maybe 8, 10 tanks before dark," he said. "If I have help, if someone can Reardon." The voice cut through the crowd like a whip crack. Captain Douglas Webb stood at the edge of the tank park, his uniform crisp, despite the mud, his face carved from the same stone as Mount Rushmore. He was regular Army, West Point class of '38, and he looked at field modifications the way a priest looked at heresy, sir, Jimmy said. Climbing down from Bad Penny, my office. Now, the office was a tent with a folding table and a field telephone that only worked when it felt like it. Captain Webb sat behind the table with Sergeant Miller standing at attention beside him, and the expression on Webb's face said that someone was about to have a very bad day. Sergeant Miller informs me you performed an unauthorized modification to a combat vehicle, Webb said, his voice flat and dangerous. Is this true? Yes, sir. Without consulting the technical manual, yes. Sir, without authorization from a certified mechanic. I am a certified Eurocorporal with 3 months of technical training, who thinks he knows better than the engineers who designed these vehicles. Webb leaned forward, his eyes cold. Do you have any idea what happens when field modifications fail in combat? When some half-trained grease monkey decides the manual is wrong and gets men killed? Jimmy's jaw tightened. Sir, I've seen 17 Shermans fail with the original design. I've watched men burn because the original design was tested by engineers with decades of experience. Your fix was invented in a foxhole by a kid from Detroit who thinks he's smarter than it works. Sir, the silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Miller shifted uncomfortably. Somewhere outside, a tank engine turned over Bad Penny, still running smooth and strong. Webb stood slowly. I don't care if it works, Corporal. I care if it's approved. I care if it follows procedure. Because the moment we start letting every mechanic make modifications based on hunches, we stop being an army and start being a mob with tanks. Permission to speak freely, sir. Denied. 200 tanks have failed because of that spring placement, Jimmy said anyway, his voice rising. 200 crews. How many men died because we followed the manual? How many more are going to die while we wait for engineers in London to approve your dismissed, Corporal? Jimmy stood there breathing hard, his bandaged hands clenched into fists. Every instinct screamed at him to shut up, to salute and walk away, to be a good soldier and follow orders. But then he thought about Private Torres, burning alive in a tank that stopped working. He thought about the crater where Miller's Sherman had almost died this morning. He thought about 67 tanks sitting useless in the mud while men died for lack of armor support. No, sir, Jimmy said quietly. The temperature in the tent dropped 20 degrees. What did you say to me? I'm not stopping, sir. You can court-martial me, you can throw me in the stockade, but I'm not going to watch more men die because we're following a manual that's wrong. Webb's face went purple. You, Captain! Sergeant Miller spoke for the first time, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made both men turn. Permission to speak. Webb's eyes never left Jimmy. Granted. Sir, we've lost 11 tanks in 8 days. Not to German fire, to transmission failure. The engineers say it'll be 2 weeks before replacement parts arrive. Meanwhile, 3rd Battalion is under strength by half, and Division is screaming for more armor support for the push towards St. Lay. Miller paused. If Corporal Reardon can bring even half these tanks back online, if his modification fails in combat, then we're no worse off than we are now, sir. But if it works, Miller gestured toward the sound of Bad Penny's engine, still running strong. That's one more tank that can move. One more crew that doesn't have to sit in the mud while their buddies die without armor support. Webb stood there, his jaw working, a man caught between doctrine and reality. Outside, Jimmy could hear more engines starting. Some enterprising crews had already started working on their own tanks, following the pattern Jimmy had shown them. If one man dies because of your modification, Webb said finally, his voice like gravel, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of this war breaking rocks at Leavenworth. Am I clear? Crystal, sir. You have until 0600 tomorrow to fix as many tanks as you can. After that, this stops until Engineering Command reviews the modification. Webb sat down heavily. And Reardon, if this works, if it actually works, you'd better pray they approve it. Because if they don't, you just violated about 15 articles of military regulation, and I won't be able to protect you. Understood? Sir, get out of my sight. Jimmy emerged from the tent into afternoon sunlight that felt like a reprieve from execution. His hands were shaking again, but not from adrenaline this time. He'd just told a captain to go to hell and somehow survived. Miller followed him out. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the dumbest. Probably both, Jimmy said. 18 hours until Webb's deadline. How many tanks can you really fix? Jimmy looked at the field of broken Shermans, at the crews already gathering around their vehicles with wrenches and hope. He thought about his father, working 70-hour weeks at the Ford plant in Detroit, coming home with grease under his fingernails and pride in his eyes. The difference between a good mechanic and a great one isn't knowledge, Jimmy, it's caring enough to fix what's broken, even when everyone says it can't be done. All of them, Jimmy said. If the crews help, if we work through the night, all of them. Miller looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we'd better get started. 1847 hours the sun was setting over Normandy, painting the bocage in shades of gold and blood when Jimmy finished the 8th tank. His hands were beyond pain now, operating on muscle memory and stubbornness. Around him, the tank park had transformed into something between a workshop and a revival meeting. Crews worked on their own tanks under Jimmy's direction, learning the modification, helping each other. Someone had rigged work lights powered by a captured German generator. The smell of coffee mixed with engine oil as the camp cooks brought food to men to focus to stop for proper meals. Corporal Hayes finished remounting his spring and looked up, his face streaked with grease and wonder. It's that simple. Just rotate it horizontal. It's that simple, Jimmy confirmed. Why didn't the engineers see it? Jimmy thought about that, about smart men in clean offices designing machines that other men would die in. About the distance between theory and reality, between what should work and what does work. Because they weren't here, he said finally. They weren't in the tanks when they failed. They didn't watch friends die. Sometimes you can't see the problem until it's trying to kill you. By midnight, 23 tanks were running. By 0300, 41. The work took on a rhythm: remove the access panel, unbolt the spring, rotate it 90 degrees, remount it, test the transmission, over and over, tank after tank, crew after crew. Men who'd been strangers became brothers in the shared labor. Kowalski taught a rookie from Baker Company how to properly torque the mounting bolts. Hayes shared cigarettes with a sergeant from 3rd Platoon whose tank had killed his driver 3 days ago. They worked in near silence, the only sounds the clink of tools and the occasional roar of an engine coming back to life. Each resurrection brought cheers, tears, fierce embraces between men who understood what it meant to have their tank, their home, their weapon, their only protection working again. Jimmy moved from tank to tank, checking work, offering guidance, his vision blurring with exhaustion. Someone pressed coffee into his hands. Someone else wrapped fresh bandages around his bleeding knuckles. The work continued. At 0530, with the eastern sky just beginning to lighten, Private Cooper climbed down from the 67th tank and gave Jimmy a weary thumbs up. That's all of them, Cooper said, his voice hoarse. Every single one. Jimmy looked at the field of Shermans, at the exhausted crews standing by their vehicles, at the impossible thing they'd accomplished together in one endless night. 67 tanks. 67 crews. 67 chances to live instead of die. All because someone had been crazy enough to question the manual. Captain Webb emerged from his tent, surveyed the scene, and said nothing. But something in his eyes had changed. Respect, maybe, or recognition. The radio crackled to life across the tank park. All units, division orders. 3rd Battalion moves out at 0800, objective St. Lay. Combat operations to commence immediately. The crews looked at their tanks, then at each other, then at Jimmy. Mount up, Sergeant Miller called. We've got a war to fight. And as the sun rose over Normandy on the 9th day after D-Day, 67 Shermans started their engines in a chorus that sounded like thunder, like promise, like men refusing to quit even when the manual said they should. Jimmy Reardon sat on the hull of Bad Penny and watched them roll out toward the sound of guns. Every engine running smooth and strong. His father would have been proud. In the official after-action reports, the restoration of 3rd Battalion's armor would be attributed to expedited field maintenance procedures. Jimmy Reardon's name would appear nowhere in the citations, but in the letters men wrote home, in the stories told around campfires, and in bars after the war. They would remember the mechanic who saved an entire battalion with nothing but a wrench and the courage to say the manual was wrong. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change the course of a war. June 18, 1944, approaching St. Lay, France 1423, hours the hedgerows fought back. 4 days of combat had taught Jimmy Reardon that Normandy itself was the enemy ancient earthen walls topped with thorny vegetation, creating a maze of killing fields where German machine gunners waited in positions they'd had for years to perfect. Every field was a fortress. Every lane was a death trap. And the Shermans, even working perfectly, were still outgunned by German Tigers and Panthers lurking in the bocage like steel predators. But at least they were moving. Jimmy rode in the bowgunner's position of Miller's Sherman. They'd lost their regular bowgunner, Martinez, to a sniper 2 days ago, watching the hedgerow country crawl past through the narrow vision slit. The radio crackled with terse commands, scattered reports, the controlled chaos of an armored advance through hell. Bulldog 3-2, hold position. We've got the transmission dissolved into static and screaming. Someone had found a panther. Miller's voice came calm over the intercom. Cooper, traverse left haze. Load AP. They'd been lucky so far. The modified Shermans were performing flawlessly, no transmission failures, no tanks left dead in the middle of German fields. 3rd Battalion had lost 6 tanks in 4 days of fighting, but all 6 had been knocked out by enemy fire, not by their own equipment failing. It was a grim victory, but it was victory nonetheless. Movement, 2 o'clock. Private Cooper's voice cracked with adrenaline. Through the vision slit, Jimmy saw a German Panzer emerging from behind a destroyed farmhouse 300 yards distant. Its turret was already turning toward them. Fire! The Sherman's 75mm gun roared, the entire tank shuddering with recoil. The German tank staggered as the armor-piercing round punched through its side armor. For one frozen moment, nothing happened. Then flame erupted from the Panzer's hatches, and Jimmy watched 4 men bail out, their uniforms on fire, their screams audible even through the Sherman's armor plate. They were just kids, couldn't have been more than 19, 20 years old. The same age as Cooper. The same age Jimmy had been when he'd enlisted. Target destroyed, Hayes reported, his voice flat. Loading he. This was the part they never showed in the recruiting posters the moment after the kill. When you realized that the thing you'd just destroyed had contained human beings who'd had mothers, sweethearts, lives. Jimmy had watched men burn on both sides now, and the only difference was the color of the uniform melting into their skin. All Bulldog elements push forward. Objective is the crossroads. At the radio erupted in overlapping voices. Reports of contact, calls for support. The advance was falling apart, units getting separated in the maze of hedgerows. Jimmy could hear the desperation creeping into the commander's voices. And then, cutting through the chaos. Any unit! This is Charlie 46. We're stuck! Transmission failed. We're taking fire and can't move. Jimmy's blood went cold. Charlie 46, that was Captain Webb's tank. Miller was already on the radio. Charlie 46, this is Bulldog 3-2. What's your position? Grid 547 to 223. We're in the open, taking fire from the transmission, dissolved into the distinctive crack of an 88mm gun. The sound that haunted every Sherman crew's nightmares. Miller, Jimmy said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. We have to go get them. That's 300 yards across open ground with German anti-tank guns covering every approach. Miller's hands were tight on the controls. It's suicide. They've got maybe 2 minutes before that 88 finds its range. The intercom went silent. Through the vision slit, Jimmy could see other Shermans from their platoon, advancing slowly through the hedgerows, none of them moving toward Charlie 46's position. The tactical choice was obvious: keep pushing forward. Don't risk more tanks trying to save one that was already dead. God damn it, Miller whispered. Then, louder, Cooper, Hazy boys want to live forever. No, Sergeant, they answered in unison. Good, because we're about to do something really stupid. Driver, hard right, full speed toward grid 547 to 223. The Sherman wheeled right and accelerated, tracks churning mud as they burst through a hedgerow and into open ground. Immediately, German machine gun fire rattled against their armor like deadly hail. An 88mm round screamed past their turret, close enough that Jimmy felt the displacement through the hull, 200 yards to Webb's position. Through the smoke and confusion, Jimmy could see Charlie 46's Sherman dead in the middle of a wheat field, its turret traversing desperately, trying to track threats coming from 3 directions at once. 2 German positions were pouring fire at it, an 88mm gun in a fortified position at the field's edge, and a Panther tank emerging from a true line. That Panther's going to kill them, Hayes said, loading another round with shaking hands. Not if we kill it first, Miller replied, his voice carved from ice. Cooper, target that Panther. Wait for my command. They were closing fast, now 150 yards. 150 yards, the Sherman bouncing over torn ground at speeds that threatened to throw a track. The 88 tracked him, fired. The round hit the ground 10 feet in front of them, showering the tank with dirt and shrapnel. Now, Cooper fired. The round caught the Panther in the turret ring, not a kill, but enough to make it stagger, its gun barrel dropping 50 yards. Miller brought them alongside Charlie 46 in a spray of mud and wheat. Positioning their tank between Webb's disabled Sherman and the German positions, they were a shield now. 33 tons of steel between the enemy and the men they'd come to save. "Reardon, you're up," Miller shouted. Jimmy didn't think. He popped the bow gunner's hatch and climbed out into hell. The sound was overwhelming machine gun fire, the crack of tank guns, the scream of artillery. The air itself seemed to be tearing apart. Jimmy ran the 10 feet to Charlie 46's hull, his boots slipping in mud, churned by shrapnel and spent bullets. Captain Webb's face appeared in the driver's hatch, eyes wide with something between terror and disbelief. "Reardon, what the hell are you? Pop your transmission access now." They worked together in the middle of the firestorm, Webb's crew passing tools out through the hatches while Jimmy tore into the transmission assembly with hands that had done this 67 times in one night and knew every bolt by feel. Around them, Miller's tank kept firing, kept drawing German attention, kept them alive 1 second at a time. The spring mount came free. Jimmy could see the problem immediately, not a failure of his modification, but a mounting bolt that had worked loose, probably from the continuous vibration of 4 days of combat. A 30-second fix under normal circumstances, an eternity under fire. An 88mm round hit Miller's tank, the impact ringing like a bell forged in hell. The Sherman rocked, but held. The round had hit the glacis plate at an angle, deflecting instead of penetrating. But it wouldn't deflect twice. "How much longer?" Webb shouted. 30 seconds. Miller's voice came over the external speaker. "We don't have 30 seconds. That Panther's coming around for another shot." Jimmy's hands moved faster than thought, faster than fear. Tighten the bolt, check the alignment, secure the panel. His father's voice in his head, "Fast is slow, and slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. Try it." Webb dropped into the driver's seat. The engine coughed, caught, and the transmission engaged with a solid mechanical purr that was the most beautiful sound Jimmy had ever heard. "We're mobile." ALL units, fall back to the world exploded. Jimmy was flying, then falling, then lying in mud that tasted like blood and cordite. His ears were ringing. His vision was blurred. Somewhere close by, something was burning. Miller's tank, the Panther, had found its mark. The 75mm round had punched through the Sherman's thinner side armor, and now flame was pouring from every hatch. Jimmy tried to stand, fell, tried again. He could see movement inside the burning tanks, someone trying to get out. Trapped by twisted metal and spreading fire. Cooper, 19 years old, from Nebraska, who'd prayed Hail Marys under his breath before every engagement. Jimmy was running before he knew he'd decided to move. The heat hit him like a physical force, searing his face, his hands. He grabbed the bow gunner's hatch, pulled with strength he didn't know he had, the metal hot enough to burn through gloves and skin. The hatch came free. Cooper's face appeared in the opening, blistered and blackened, his eyes wide with terror and pain. Jimmy grabbed his arms, pulled, the kid's uniform melting against his palms. Cooper came free in a rush, and they fell together into the mud. Behind them, Miller's tank exploded as the ammunition cooked off, a pillar of flame reaching toward the sky. Miller Hayes, the driver whose name Jimmy had never learned, all gone. Hands were grabbing him now, pulling him and Cooper away from the inferno. Captain Webb's voice cutting through the ringing in his ears. "Fall back, fall back." June 19th, 1944 Field Hospital, 15 kilometers behind the lines, 0920 hours. Jimmy woke up to white light and the smell of antiseptic. "Easy," a nurse's voice said. "American, female, tired. You've got second-degree burns on both hands and your face. Don't try to talk yet." But Jimmy was trying to sit up because he needed to know about Cooper, about Webb, about how many tanks they'd lost in that field that felt like it had happened both a lifetime ago and 5 minutes ago. "Private Cooper is alive," the nurse said, reading his mind. "Severe burns, but he'll survive. You got him out just in time. Just in time." The phrase felt obscene. Miller Hayes and the driver hadn't had it just in time. They'd had a German shell and fire and death. How many? Jimmy managed to croak. 7 tanks lost yesterday, 43 still operational. The nurse checked his bandages. "Captain Webb has been asking about you. He wanted me to tell you something when you woke up." "What?" "He said to tell you that your modification held up." "Every single one. The only tanks we lost were from enemy fire, not equipment failure." The nurse smiled slightly. "He also said he's putting you in for a Bronze Star." Jimmy lay back against the pillow, staring at the canvas ceiling of the hospital tent. A Bronze Star for saving Webb's tank. But no medal could bring back Miller's crew. No citation could erase the smell of burning men. "There's someone else here to see you," the nurse said, stepping aside. Captain Webb stood at the entrance to the tent, his uniform cleaned, but his face showing the weight of 4 days of combat. He walked to Jimmy's cot and stood there for a long moment, just looking at him. "I was wrong," Webb said finally. "About the manual. About procedure. About you." He pulled up a chair, sat down heavily. "Engineering Command reviewed your modification. They're implementing it across all M4 variants in the European theater. Effective immediately." Jimmy said nothing. "They're calling it the Reardon modification in the technical bulletins. They estimate it'll save... well, they estimate a lot of lives." Webb paused. "I know that doesn't bring back your crew. I know it doesn't make yesterday any easier. But for what it's worth, you were right. And I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner. How many tanks did we lose before I fixed them?" Jimmy asked, his voice raw. "How many men died because it took me 8 days to see the pattern?" "You can't think like that. You'll drive yourself crazy. Torres burned to death because his transmission locked up during a counterattack. Martinez got shot by a sniper because we were stranded when our drive system failed." Jimmy looked at his bandaged hands. "I see their faces every time I close my eyes. I see Miller's tank exploding. I see Corporal Webb's voice was gentle but firm. You saved 67 tanks. You saved hundreds of men who were still alive because their Shermans kept moving. You can't save everyone. That's not a lesson they teach in mechanics school, but it's the most important one you'll learn in this war." Through the open tent flap, Jimmy could see other wounded men being brought in the endless stream of broken bodies that war produced. Medics moving between cots, nurses changing bandages, the machinery of death and survival grinding forward. "The battalion moves out in 2 days, Webb said, standing. "Division wants us back in the line for the push towards St. Lay. We need every tank we can get." He paused at the tent entrance. "We need you, Reardon, not just as a mechanic, as a reminder that sometimes the craziest idea is the one that saves lives." After Webb left, Jimmy lay there watching shadows move across the canvas ceiling. His hands hurt, his face hurt, everything hurt. But somewhere out there, tanks were moving that would have been dead without his modification. Crews were alive who would have burned. The war would grind forward, it always did, but maybe, just maybe, a few more men would survive it because one mechanic from Detroit had been crazy enough to question the manual. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was something. July 25th, 1944, Operation Cobra. The breakout from Normandy, the modification spread like wildfire through the armored divisions. Tank crews taught other tank crews. Field mechanics implemented the change without waiting for official authorization. By the time the great breakout from Normandy began, nearly every Sherman in the European theater had been modified. The official reports would credit improved maintenance procedures and expedited parts delivery for the dramatic reduction in transmission failures. But the men who'd been there, the tank crews who'd lived through those desperate days in the Bukash, they knew the truth. They knew it was one corporal with bloody hands and a crazy idea working through the night while everyone else waited for the manual to save them. On July 25th, when American armor finally broke through the German lines and began the race across France, 3rd Battalion was at the tip of the spear. 61 tanks rolling forward in a steel avalanche, their transmissions running smooth and strong. Jimmy Reardon rode with them, a sergeant now, promoted in the field. His hands had healed enough to hold a wrench. His face bore scars that would last a lifetime, reminders of the day he'd pulled Cooper from a burning tank. They never spoke about Miller, Hayes, or the driver whose name Jimmy had finally learned, Danny Chen, 23, from San Francisco. Engaged to a girl named Susan who would get a letter that started with, "We regret to inform you." But sometimes, when the column stopped for fuel or repairs, Jimmy would climb up on a Sherman's hull and just listen to the engine, running smooth, strong, alive, and he'd think about his father, working in that garage in Detroit, teaching a kid that the difference between a good mechanic and a great one was caring enough to fix what was broken, even when everyone said it couldn't be done. Especially when everyone said it couldn't be done. The war would go on for another 10 months. Berlin would fall, victory would come, and in the after-action reports, in the technical bulletins, in the dry language of military efficiency, the Rearden modification would save an estimated 2,000 lives before the war's end. But Jimmy Rearden would remember it differently. He'd remember the sound of Miller's tank exploding, the smell of Cooper's burning uniform, the weight of Torres's dog tags, forwarded to him by a chaplain who thought he should have them. He'd remember that every life saved came at the cost of the ones that couldn't be saved, that every victory was built on someone's sacrifice, that the manual was written by people who'd never had to watch friends die, and he'd remember that sometimes being crazy enough to try something new, to question what everyone accepted as truth, was the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. September 15, 1945, Detroit. Michigan Rearden's garage, the sign, went up on a Tuesday morning, Rearden's garage, if it's broken. We'll fix it. Jimmy stood outside, coffee in one hand, wrench in the other. Watching the sun rise over a city that had built the machines that won a war, the scars on his hands ached in the cold. The scars on his face had faded 2 pale lines that people politely didn't ask about. Inside the garage, a 42 Ford sat waiting for a transmission rebuild. Regular work. Honest work? The kind where no one died if you made a mistake. But sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Jimmy would go out to the garage and just sit with the tools his father had left him. And he'd think about 67 tanks brought back to life in one impossible night. About Cooper, who'd survived and gone home to Nebraska. About Webb, who'd written Jimmy a letter from occupation duty in Germany. About Miller, Hayes, and Chen, who'd never written anything again. The bell above the garage door chimed. A customer, probably. Someone with a broken car and the expectation that it could be fixed. Jimmy set down his coffee, picked up his wrench, and went to work. Because that's what you did. You fixed what was broken. You questioned the manual when it was wrong. You saved who you could, mourned who you couldn't, and kept moving forward. One repair at a time. One life at a time. One crazy idea at a time. The end in 1947, the U.S. Army officially adopted the horizontal volute spring mounting system for all M4 Sherman variants in its technical manual. The modification was attributed to field testing and engineering analysis. James Rearden's name appeared nowhere in the official documentation. But in the letters veterans wrote to each other, in the reunions where old tankers gathered to remember friends lost and battles won, they told the story of the mechanic who saved a battalion with nothing but a wrench and the courage to say the experts were wrong. Sometimes, that's all it takes. Sometimes, being a little bit crazy is the same thing as being a hero.